Good afternoon, everyone. It is my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce our Chief Curator and Vice President of Collections and Research, Robert Leath. Now, how to introduce Robert? Well, after a distinguished career at the Historic Charleston Foundation, at Kenmore, at Colonial Williamsburg, and now, I think, 11 years at MESDA, we've all have our very own favorite Robert Leath story. Suffice it to say that Robert, more than anybody else, has really spearheaded the reinvigoration of the museum over those past 11 years. And even more than that, Robert has really been a mentor to me in American decorative arts scholarship and research. And I thought, what advice would Robert give me in introducing him? And immediately I could hear Robert's voice saying, the more eminent the scholar, the briefer the introduction. And so it appears I've already gone on too long, and with that I give you Robert Leath.
Daniel, I would like to thank you for a truly perfect introduction. Let me just say before we get started, this has been an incredible year for everybody at MESDA. We are very excited to be wrapping up this year with this issue of the journal. All the research that you're hearing today being poured into the journal, plus our own Johanna Brown with all of her work on Karsten Peterson. It's really going to be a very special commemorative issue. And this team of scholars that I get to be with, 365 days of the year is such a pleasure to work with, and what we get to do together gives me certainly meaning to my life in a way that I can't quite imagine otherwise. What I'm going to talk to you about is when I get bored with budgets and paperwork and administrative work, I get to go into the MESDA Research Center and just chill out for a while doing documentary research. I get to go into the collection and actually work with objects, and that's what I call rest and relaxation. So it's been fun to be able to take on a project that I'll present this morning called The 9 Lives of Robert Deans, a cabinet maker and master builder in Edinburgh, Charleston, and London, 1740 to 1780. The main object I'll be talking about is this cabinet on chest in the MESDA collection. Truly one of the most extraordinary pieces of furniture made in 18th century America with extraordinary carving. And the fact that we can now attribute that to some artisans working in Charleston, South Carolina in the 1750s, better understand who they are, who they were, their community, their origins, has been very exciting. And the fact that we can open up that piece and see that it has to be one of the most ambitious interiors on any piece of furniture made in colonial America. You'll notice the very fine exotic wood cross-banding that's around all of those interior drawers, one of the truly exceptionally fine features associated with this piece. So when we were hard at work on selecting what needed to go into the Carolina Mike McNamara Southern Masterworks Gallery, it didn't take us very long to realize that the cabinet on chest in MESDA's collection from Charleston, South Carolina had to be one of the preeminent pieces where we could not just figuratively but quite literally place it on a pedestal. Now, because we know we're dealing with British immigrant craftsmen, and particularly in this case with a Scottish immigrant craftsman, we always have to wonder, who were these people? What were they like? What led them to come to America? Were they like William Adam, whose portrait you see here, the great Scottish architect, painted by William Aikman in 1727? Sort of this genius designer. He's got his page, he's pointing to it. You're sure that there's some floor plan or some building elevation that he's looking at, something that really sort of epitomizes his artistic genius? Or were they perhaps a little bit more like William Hogarth's Thomas Rakewell, depicted in The Rake's Progress, that he painted and went on to become engraved? Or were they perhaps a combination of the two? Did they have a little bit of William Adam and a little bit of Thomas Rakewell, all kind of mixed up and jumbled into one? Well, I'd already worked on Robert Dean's, the Scottish cabinetmaker, a little bit when I had the good luck of being in Edinburgh and having dinner with Ian Gow, who's the curator of the Scottish National Trust, and with Stephen Jackson, who's the curator of decorative arts for the Scottish National Museum, when Stephen had come across Robert Dean's name as well in this extraordinary court case. And he proceeded to read some of the testimony from some of the 18 witnesses who were called to testify in this Edinburgh court case. And he would read a little bit, and I would say, "You must be kidding." And he would read a little more, and I would say, "You're making this up." And he would read a little more, and I said, "I can't believe this." I said, "I don't think there could be a single other immigrant craftsman to early America about whom we now know so much, in some cases, more than we even want to know, in a way that shows how Robert Dean's epitomizes a combination of William Adam and Thomas Rakewell, and why, in 1749, he boarded a boat to come to America and landed in Charleston, South Carolina. We know exactly why he got on that boat. So the Robert Dean story takes us to Edinburgh, Scotland, which you see here in 1670, when it was still very much a medieval walled city, the capital of Scotland, Edinburgh Castle up on the hill, towering over the population below. The suburbs were yet to appear. New town of Edinburgh, designed by the Adams brothers, that wasn't even a concept yet. But we now know that Robert Deans was born in 1721. He was born in a small town called Tranent, which lay about 16 miles east of this walled city. And as Edinburgh was undergoing all of its changes, turning itself into what would later become the Athens of the North, the center for learning and science and medicine and philosophy, and even also of design, that was the Edinburgh that gave birth to Robert Deans. We know because, but for this court case and a few parish records, there is one surviving bill of sale for Robert Deans as a young cabinet maker. And he didn't have just any random patron when he was 28 years old, beginning to work on his own. His patron was this man, Andrew Fletcher, Lord Milton, one of the most important figures in Edinburgh in the 1720s and 30s and 40s, one of the chief judges of the entire Scottish legal system. And Lord Milton was an incredibly important patron. On the right, you're looking at the published design and floor plan for his Edinburgh townhouse. And he didn't have just any architect to be involved in designing that townhouse. He had none other than William Adam, the man shown in that portrait, whose sons would go on to really lay out and design that new town of Edinburgh, and whose second son, Robert Adam, would become one of the great emperors of British architecture in the second half of the 18th century. William Adam had also been involved in Lord Milton's country house, Brunstane House, about 8 miles east of Edinburgh. And here you see how what's in its earliest roots was a medieval castle was being transformed into a great Baroque country house with a classical facade. And this is, again, part of the artistic environment in which Robert Deans was emerging. And while we don't yet know, we've never found the exact record to prove who he trained under, I think it's quite possible that he was affiliated with the William Adam work crews who were involved in a lot of this construction. Alternatively, we know from Lord Milton's surviving records that he patronized the best cabinet makers in Edinburgh. The most important of these was Francis Brodie. And on the right, you're looking at Francis Brodie's amazing bill and bill head depicting Scottish-made Baroque furniture coming out of Brodie's shop, this being a group that was made in 1741-42 for the Duke of Gordon. And if you just let your eyes look across that furniture, you're looking at highly carved, highly ornamental chairs and case pieces. You've got a desk and bookcase with looking glass doors. You've got a carved eagle pier table with a looking glass above it. And Brodie was even, advertising that he specialized in these important classical designs because, what was his cabinet shop called? It was called Palladio's Head, referring to the Italian classical designer Andrea Palladio. So Francis Brodie was the Palladio's Head of Edinburgh. But Lord Milton also patronized other cabinet makers like Alexander Peter, to whom April spoke earlier. Now, Brodie's clientele also included the Earl and Countess of Dumfries, who, when they hired the Adams to work on Leath Norris House in the 1750s, which you see here, and here you see the bill of sale for one grouping of furniture that included one particularly extraordinary object that came with a little handwritten label in the back, noting that this was from Francis Brodie for the Honorable the Earl of Dumfries. And right off the bat, you've got one little clue. The original brasses that survive on this piece of furniture are what in Charleston are typically called, sort of vernacularly, shark's tooth brasses, because that is one of the most common mid-18th century brasses to show up on Charleston furniture. There's a connection going on in this transatlantic mercantile world between what Francis Brodie is making in Edinburgh and the things that we start to show up in Charleston. Now, luckily, the piece survives, and it's this. So this is Francis Brodie's 1753 ladies' closet made for the Earl and Countess of Dumfries. And the fact that it's a ladies' closet really means that although the Earl paid for it, it was really for the Countess. The basic definition of a Scottish ladies' closet is that it's a pretty standard chest of drawers surmounted by a cabinet. The cabinet has a single leaf, large looking glass door that's hinged on one side, and once you open that, you're into the world of everything an aristocratic woman might need for storing valuables, correspondence, books, a writing desk surface, a smaller dressing glass mirror that opens to have smaller drawers, all of these different specialized forms for an aristocratic woman. What's great is that this flat top version is not the only Scottish ladies' closet known, it's just the best documented because of the surviving bill of sale, the fact that the Dumfries left Leath Norris House, they took this piece of furniture with them, they built Dumfries House, designed by Robert Adam, and lo and behold, this piece of furniture is still at Dumfries House today for study. But on the right, you see another ladies' closet that, I think if you look at the shape of the looking glass, could this be from Francis Brodie's shop? I think it could be, but obviously it's taking out of a large shop a different attitude toward its design and its production. It has these engaged pilasters with stop fluting, a scroll pediment, very architectural, very architectonic. And suddenly we can take the Charleston-made piece that we can now attribute to Robert Deans and fully place it into its Scottish context and recognize that this is the work being done in Charleston, South Carolina by a craftsman who had to be coming out of Edinburgh, who had to be coming out of a craftsman with the exposure to the aristocratic craftsmanship schools going on for architectural work, for cabinet making, like the work of Francis Brodie, in a way that suggests that Robert Deans must have been coming out of the Francis Brodie, William Adam sort of school before he moved to Charleston, South Carolina. Now on to the court case. It kind of conjures the William Hogarth Industry and Idleness series that he published in 1747, which would be just 2 years before Deans got on the boat. But as many of you may know, it's the story of two apprentices working at their looms in a shop, one very industrious, one very idle. One will go on to great success, one will go on to rack and ruin. And for the one who's successful, the industrious apprentice is a favorite and entrusted by his master, which we can see here. And if he's also smart, he will perform the duty of a Christian. And the duty of a Christian might include going to church with the boss's daughter and being so enraptured that that would go on and lead to a marriage. And the marriage would go and lead to the son-in-law taking over the business, and that this was the path to great success for any industrious 18th century apprentice. Or you could be a bad apprentice, and you could end up in a garret with a common prostitute. And this is where I want to read you directly from some of the testimony in this case. Because Robert Deans, in 1743, it's very clear about when they met, he met a woman named Jean Bell. Jean Bell was the widow of a recently bankrupted merchant. She operated a very small shop in the middle of downtown Edinburgh and lived in a little two-room house alongside the fish market in Fish Market Close. She had a stepdaughter named Maitland Henderson who still lived with her. And when the court convened to hear the case about whether Robert Deans had ever had a legal marriage with Jean Bell and whether the child that they had together was legitimate or not, even though that child had died, and even though Robert Deans was now engaged to be married to another woman, and Jean Bell was coming after him, demanding financial support and recognition of a marriage, her stepdaughter was called into court to testify, and Maitland Henderson revealed that she had seen Deans and her stepmother, quote, frequently in bed together, sometimes together in the bed of the room, and sometimes in the bed in the kitchen. And, quote, sometimes at the same time the deponent was lying in the other bed in the kitchen. Another witness, who was a servant who lived next door to Jean Bell, who must have had a glass against the wall, testified that she knew that Deans had stayed with Bell, quote, for some time as a lodger, but that in May of 1745, a minister who was attending the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church also lodged in Bell's house and, quote, took up the bedroom where Deans usually lay, end quote. And, quote, there was no other bed in the house than that in which the minister lay, and that she had overheard, quote, a foot, which she took to be Mr. Deans, approach Jean Bell's bed on the floor. And finally, Mary Wallace, who was the wife of a fencing master in Edinburgh, swore that Deans and Bell, quote, lived together in a house in the Fish Market Close, and that she, quote, one time saw them lying in a bed in the kitchen, and that, quote, he was in bed naked. And Bell opened the door, and they came in and sat in the kitchen while he was lying in the same bed, and Bell sat down at his bedside. And this testimony went on and on and on. And all the people who would testify that, yes, they had lived together, yes, they were seen together, but she never changed her name to become Mrs. Dean. She was always either Mrs. Henderson or Jean Bell. That gets a little bit complicated because in Scottish practice, women actually maintain their own born surname throughout their lives. So she was really known as Mrs. Bell, as Jean Bell or Mrs. Henderson. What's amazing about this testimony is suddenly, here's an immigrant American craftsman coming to 18th century America, and we are in his world in the continent. We know where in Edinburgh he is. We know where he's living. We know Jean Bell has this little 2-room apartment in one of these houses that has sort of a common parlor sitting room with a bed in it in the front and a kitchen in the back with an additional bed and pallet for Jean Bell and her stepdaughter. And we know that there's a neighbor with a servant right there, and she's got a glass to her ear listening to everything going on next door. So in this way, Robert Deans was a little bit more like Thomas Rakewell than William Adam. But then something began to happen. In 1747, they had split up. Bell had moved to another house. Deans had moved to another house in another part of town. Later, they were seen cavorting together again. But by November 1747, Deans was courting another woman who also seems to have been an older widow named Mrs. Curry. And Mrs. Curry began to hear rumors that there had been a child and there was a possible marriage to Jean Bell. And to satisfy her curiosity, Robert Deans took one of her friends, a Mrs. Young, to see Jean Bell, quote, to ask her the reason why she had made such a noise. And Bell acknowledged that she, quote, was not married to the defender, Deans, but declared that nevertheless Deans had, quote, ruined her by living upon her. Deans replied that he had paid Bell 6 pence a day for the meals that he had received from her, plus paid her for the lodging on a weekly basis, and said that, but if he was owing her anything, he would pay it, to which Bell replied that, quote, he was owing her nothing. So this report went back to Mrs. Curry with the summation that Mrs. Young finally asked Jean Bell directly whether she had borne Deans's child and whether, quote, he had been over familiar with her. And I never thought I would use this language at the podium for a decorative arts lecture. And Jean Bell then answered, quote, with some passion, what do you mean to say so? Do you take me for a whore? End quote. That was when I said to Stephen, what? She said, what? Well, Robert Deans did go on to marry, and here we see the full series of the Rake's Progress. He did go on to marry Marion Curry. The testimony identifies when they were married, where they were married. But as you can imagine, Jean Bell came after him. And she came after him for 20 years. And all of that testimony is in the court trial, and all of that will soon be in the upcoming article for the MESDA Journal. So if there's any question why this particular British craftsman left Europe to come to America, it was very, very clear because he lost the case. He lost the case in Edinburgh, and they ruled that he owed her financial support. So in this case, what was his motivation? You'd have to say it was a little bit of, ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Now, the great thing about this is now Robert Deans is a craftsman that we can map. And we can map him across his career like nobody else. We know that at the foot of St. Giles Cathedral that you see here was the Fish Market Close, And this is where they lived together from 1743 to 1746. They split up for a while. She moved here. He moved up here. This is where he met Mrs. Curry. Later, she moved here. And in terms of where the gold was coming from, Lord Milton's house was right there, right down the Canongate High Street today. And the more fashionable church, the Tron Church, right in the middle of their later residences. We can map Robert Dean's Scotland. He was born in Tranent, here, 16 miles east of Edinburgh, where he trained. Almost at midpoint was Brunstane House, Lord Milton's country house. We know the town where his and Jean Bell's child was nursed until she died and was buried there. We know that he later received his banns for marriage at St. Cuthbert's Church there, that they were married in Gilmerton or at the mansion near Gilmerton, which might refer to the Drum, another William Adam house, right in the Gilmerton neighborhood outside of Edinburgh. And here you see the Tranent Parish Church. We now know Robert Dean's Scotland and Robert Dean's Edinburgh in a way that we understand about very few other colonial American craftsmen. And in a way that allows us to realize that Robert Dean's Edinburgh was that Edinburgh of the 1730s and the 1740s. It was that very fermenting place where architects like William Adam and cabinetmakers like Francis Brodie were transforming a medieval landscape into a classical Baroque landscape with furniture forms like the Lady's Closet. And of course, William Adams' son, Robert, would go on to become one of the preeminent designers throughout all of Great Britain. And as a 22 to 28-year-old man, Robert Deans was a small player in this world, but this is what he was exposed to. So that when he arrived in Charleston with Mrs. Curry, to escape the sound of the bell, he immediately advertised in the South Carolina Gazette, Robert Deans, joiner from Scotland. He hooked up with a Mr. Bassett, who was a tailor, who we know his father lived in Edinburgh. The Scottish connection was following him. And guess what? Lord Milton, his brother-in-law lived in Charleston, South Carolina. His wife was named Elizabeth Kinlaw. Her older brother was the 3rd Baronet of Gilmerton. Her younger brother, James Kinlaw, had come to South Carolina. By this time, he was one of the richest planters and merchants in all of Charleston, South Carolina. He was a member of the Royal Council, connected throughout the power structure. And in many ways, you have to wonder if Robert Deans didn't even hear about Charleston, South Carolina, and first envisioned the idea of going there through conversation and exposure to Lord and Lady Milton, and the idea that a letter of introduction might well have traveled with him. Now, this was also a city in the process of being transformed. Charleston was no longer the walled city that was depicted in the 1730s, but was in the process of becoming the city that we see in the Thomas Leach view, the city that would be epitomized by great buildings like the Exchange Building at the end of Broad Street, by St. Michael's Church, built in the 1750s, by many of the great residences that were beginning to go up as the old walls came down and as fires and hurricanes had knocked many of the older structures down, and the Charleston merchant planter elite was ready to build in the brand new, latest British style, new houses that could express their new economic position. Now, in doing this research, I came across something that we hadn't discovered before, that I hadn't seen before, and it only happened a couple of weeks ago. In 1751, Robert Deans witnessed a will, and his name appears right after the name of John Drayton of Drayton Hall. And it was a family will among planters on the Ashley River. There was no reason for Robert Deans to be among this group of people. And when I first read it, I hadn't had too much administrative work. I wasn't as up on things as I should have been. I came back to the office hallway and I said, John Drayton, 1751. Was John Drayton building anything in 1751? Well, when I worked at the Historic Charleston Foundation, the standard dates for Drayton Hall were 1738 to 1742. I didn't realize that Drayton Hall had recently done dendrochronology, and the original framing timbers in the attic are now absolutely known to have been felled in 1747 and 1748. And so the new assigned period of construction for Drayton Hall is a construction period that begins in 1748, and for a house of this size and stature, probably went on into the early 1750s. In other words, within 1 year of Robert Deans being off the boat, he's in John Drayton's company witnessing a family will with him, and it just happens to be at the same time Drayton Hall is completing its construction. And it just happens to be at the end of that construction when all of the finest interior woodwork is being completed. And I think we can now imagine what Robert Dean's role in Drayton Hall could have been. Again, this is something that I came across just a couple of weeks ago. So I think there's a lot more comparative analysis that needs to be done. But the idea that Drayton Hall was being finished within a year or two of Robert Dean's arrival, and Robert Deans is with John Drayton, witnessing a family will. It's interesting new evidence for consideration now that Drayton Hall has this newly defined period of construction. Now, just 3 months after Robert Deans arrived comes the next big player in this drama. Henry Burnett, house and ship carver from London, who gives notice that he's now in town and prepared to do all the best house, furniture, and architectural and ship carving in town. And what's part of the same methodology that April has used, that Gary has used, is that we can now take the MESDA Craftsman database and we can profile these craftsman communities. We can now fairly well know who's in town and who's not. And in 1750, guess what? Robert Deans is the only professional carver in Charleston. The previous guy had died 3 years earlier, Thomas Watson, in 1747. I can identify one other man, locally born, experimenting in carving. I'll go into that in the article a little bit, but not a professional, not from London. And Henry Burnett seems to have had no competition from 1750 until 1756, when Henry Hardcastle shows up very briefly, only for a year. And he really never has any competition from 1750 until 1760, but we know he did the carving at St. Michael's Church. We can relate that, the pineapple finial on the pulpit, to the pineapple finial on the ladies' closet, and realize this piece of Scottish furniture made in Charleston has a St. Michael's pineapple on the top. And we can begin to understand that one of the greatest public commissions that's fully documented in Charleston 1750, St. Michael's Church, we know that Robert Deans made a play for the contract for all the interior woodwork. He doesn't seem to have gotten it, but the bills of the church prove that there was an Irishman named Samuel Carty who received the contract for the construction. He was an architect. That the cabinetmaker Thomas Elf got the contract for most of the interior woodwork, and that Henry Burnett was paid over £1,000 for all of the interior carving. And we can now take that information and begin to look at what John Bivens had already pieced together, and look at the rhythm of Greek key frets, of Chinese frets and Greek key frets, and carved shells, and again the Greek key fret, and relate it to a whole group of architectural carving, all of which can be assigned to Henry Burnett, all from the 1750s. But now we've got to ask the next question: who built the house? If Burnett did the carving, who built the house? Who was doing the joinery? Who was designing that chimney piece? And that's where Robert Deans, I think, really begins to come into the picture as a primary player. And one reason we know that is because Henry Burnett's career is relatively brief. He dies in 1761. He appears to have never had children. He did marry a well-to-do widow of a tailor. Interestingly, they signed a marriage agreement, and indicating that all of her property was to remain with her. So when he died, his inventory is rather sparse. She dies very shortly thereafter, and that's where all the mahogany furniture is, that's where the two slaves are, that's where all the shop goods are. So Henry Burnett is not living in an attic clinging to his carver's tools and 2 hats and 2 wigs. He's living much more comfortably than that. But the most important thing is that when Henry Burnett dies intestate, the court, in order to settle his estate, appoints these 3 appraisers: Samuel Carty, the Irish architect; Robert Deans, the Scottish cabinetmaker and joiner and later builder; Thomas Elf, the English cabinetmaker. And I think what we now start to see is that we can think of these 4 people, Burnett, Carty, Deans, and Elf, in terms of the transmission of British design into Charleston in the 1750s. I'm now going to refer to these as the Big 4. These are the Big 4. The great thing about the Charleston ladies' closet in the MESDA collection is that we can even say we know who originally owned it. It came to us from California with a full family provenance, all the way back to William Lawton Smith, the son of this man, Benjamin Smith. Although with a little bit of a problem in that if you looked at the published genealogies of the Smith family, they tend to stop with William's son, William Ragsmith, and not identify he and his family that went on to live in New York and California, from whom this piece came. But I'll reserve that story for Bessie Hanahan for later. But because of the interior and its relationship to the Edinburgh ladies' closet form, I think we can say this piece was really made for Benjamin's first wife, Anne Lawton Smith. She was important to him in his own right. His business partner was Miles Bruton. Miles Bruton was no more than her half-brother. She was a connected Charleston aristocratic woman who if there was a woman in Charleston 1750s who deserved a ladies' closet, she was it. And how remarkable that we have the piece of furniture and her portrait to really begin to understand an important piece of furniture made for a Charleston woman. How even more incredible that the house survives. The Benjamin Smith house still stands on the corner of Church and Broad Street. And when Benjamin Smith died, and when his oldest son died, Thomas Lawton Smith, there are still room by room inventories for that house. And we can really understand the house of a successful Charleston merchant. Here's the plat for the house, showing the floor plan. Notice the piazza here. Notice the survival of the piazza there, probably in an early 19th century reconstruction. The first floor of this house was essentially blown out in the 19th century. It's since been restored. But the front room on the first floor was all mercantile business. The back rooms, entered off of the piazza, brought you into 2 small private parlors, well, actually not small, 2 private parlors on the back, where you then went up the staircase to the 2nd and 3rd floors. In typical Charleston fashion, the front of the house across the 2nd floor, that's where the best entertaining rooms were. That's where the big, fully articulated dining room and master bedchamber were. And then there were additional family chambers in the back of the 2nd floor, same floor plan, and then 4 more bedrooms up on the 3rd floor. By that time, you've got a cross hall that goes all the way to the front of the building. And if you look at that probate inventory, I think we can find this piece of furniture. It's one of 2 entries. All the mahogany furniture is identified, described, valued, but they didn't have the term ladies' closet in Charleston, South Carolina, particularly the other wealthy merchants and planners who were taking his inventory. So if you look at his inventory, most of the mahogany furniture, a desk and bookcase, is valued at 15 pounds. A double chest is valued at 20 pounds. Then in those 2 best rooms on the 2nd floor, you hit a mahogany wardrobe, and it's valued at 30 pounds. Much more than the other pieces. Until you hit a piece that's in one of the back bed chambers. And it's described as a mahogany double chest. Now, it's not the typical double chest form we most think of with Charleston, but could this be described as a double chest? Yes. And its value is 40 pounds. More than the wardrobe and twice as much as the desk and bookcase and the other double chest. It is by far the most valuable piece of furniture. Interestingly, by the time Benjamin Smith dies in 1770, Anne's been dead for 10 years. He's remarried. He has a second family. His oldest son from the first marriage is still living in the house. Could this piece of furniture moved into one of the back rooms because it will continue to be associated with the family of his first wife, in fact, owned by descendants who will carry the name Lawton all the way into the 20th century. So amazing that we have the piece of furniture, we have the portraits, we have the house, we have the floor plan, we have the inventories, we can place it in the space. Our best evidence for what he was capable of is that by the early 1760s, he had the commission from none other than Henry Lawrence, the great Charleston patriot, to build and finish the interior for him of this house, the Henry Lawrence house, that came down about 1920. A two-story brick house with an attic story up above, but luckily, one of the authors of an early Lawrence biography was able to go into the house and completely describe it. Quote, "The house is a plain, rather barn-like, square-built structure." Just look at that photograph and you can see what he's saying. "With jerkin head roof and consists of 4 large rooms downstairs and 4 up. As one enters the small hallway at the south, amounting to little more than a vestibule, stairs on the left lead up to the upper story, and a door to the right admits to the library. The library measures 18 feet 8 inches by 17 feet 2 inches. On one side of the broad chimney, there are built as part of the house high mahogany bookcases, whose beautiful glass doors, patterned in octagons with subordinate squares and triangles, express dignity and refinement. To the east of the library is the dining room, whose dimensions are 27.5 by 17 1/3 feet, proclaim the hospitality for which it was designed. The paneled chimney piece measures 10 feet and 3/4 inches across all the way to the ceiling. Immediately above is the ballroom, of the same proportions. Some of the mantels are of marble and some of simply carved wood. Simplicity of style and dignity of proportions in keeping with the master's taste in all things mark all the apartments." We know from an 18th century description the house also had what a servant described as a mahogany staircase. So you have to think about those built-in mahogany bookshelves with Chinese patterned glazing and the fully paneled chimney pieces, the mahogany staircase that's described, to know that when Robert Deans was getting ready to leave for England, he and Henry Lawrence were corresponding, and Henry Lawrence was saying, "When are you going to finish my house? When are you going to finish my house? I need to move in. When are you going to finish my house?" And then we come to the next letter. "I need you to finish my house. I need to move in." So we have very firm documentation that Robert Deans did this, although they went on to maintain a lifelong friendship. So finally, by 1765, Deans had left Charleston. He had moved to London, but he had also developed a piece of property called Dean's Square, where he had built spec housing for profit. By this time, he was a real estate developer. He was a land speculator. And when he was leaving, he appointed none other than Alexander Petrie, the Scottish-born silversmith, to be his attorney and to conduct all of his business affairs from that point on. Now, once again, this is a man whose career we can map to great detail. Here is where he first lived on Church Street when he landed. Here is where Henry Burnett first set up shop when he landed 3 months later. There's the Benjamin Smith house. There's St. Michael's Church where Burnett did all his carving. Deans didn't get that contract, but he did get the contract for the Congregationalist Church right down the road. Here's Henry Lawrence's house, and here's Dean's Square, that big block where Deans built all of his spec houses for profit. When he goes to London, he initially settles in a very fashionable upper middle class neighborhood on Fludyer Street, just up from the Parliament buildings. Westminster Abbey. Suffers financial hard times. The American Revolution hits him. he moves to Chandos Street, right here in the shadow of St. Martin's in the Fields Church, the same church that Gary identified earlier as where Martin Finninger was married in London in 1768. But why should we be surprised? Robert Deans and Marion Curry land in London, and within 4 years, Jean Bell marched back to the court in Edinburgh, and her lawyers, quote, presented a summons of awakening to the commissary court. And in their filing, they summarized the case that, quote, Robert Deans was born a wright in Edinburgh. Wright being the Scottish word for cabinetmaker and master joiner. Robert Deans was born a wright in Edinburgh, which employment he followed with success, until the pursuer, Jean Bell, prevailed in the present case of marriage against him. Then, in order to disappoint her, he thought proper to retire to South Carolina in America, where he continued for about 20 years, carrying on his business of a wright with great success, and made 3,000 pounds sterling, with which he has come some time ago over to London, where he at present resides, living with another woman. End quote. Well, what can we say? In many ways, as decorative arts historians and collectors, we have to be grateful to Jean Bell. We now know all of this material about him, and if she hadn't pursued him in court, he might be a very obscure craftsman. And now he's on the verge of becoming very famous thanks to Jean Bell. So if we now look at Charleston cabinet making during this period, and if we go back to Brad and John's book, that 3-volume work on Charleston furniture, what can we start to understand about what we initially might call the Henry Burnett, Robert Deans group? Are these a unified group of Charleston furniture made in the 1750s, or is the story more complex, as it almost always is? Just ask Johanna, or June, or Daniel, or Gary, or April. April talked about Adam Bowett and his recent visit here, and his work in looking at some pieces of furniture in our collection. And one day, Adam and I got to play in the collection so I could take a break from budgeting and administrative paperwork. And we actually started pulling drawers out of these two pieces that have been associated as part of the same shop group to ask the basic question, are they the same or are they different? Do they represent the same cabinet shop group? And what is pretty undeniable, particularly when you look at the Ionic capitals on the pilasters, when you look at some of the other related carving details, is that Henry Burnett, through his documented work at St. Michael's, is pretty clearly the carver for this group. But it has to be more complicated than that. When you get into the construction, it breaks down, and they become far more different than they're the same. If you pull out the bottom drawer on the desk and bookcase, that drawer runs directly on the case bottom that you see here, with drawer stops here and here. The base construction for the ladies' closet is significantly different, and significantly different enough that it just represents a different school of construction. Here, the drawer rail or the drawer blade sits on top of the bottom of the case. Mitered to that are these runners, so that its bottom drawer slides above the case bottom on the rail and on the runners. And that's a pretty significant difference in construction. If you go to the small drawers on the ladies' closet, the grain runs perpendicular to the front of the drawer, and it's set within 3 sides of the small drawer and glued and open on the back. On the desk and bookcase, it runs parallel. The grain runs parallel to the front of the drawer. And it's set within all four sides and glued in place. And very consistently, these applied drawer stops at the back of the drawers. And again, from a drawer construction point of view, this is a pretty significant difference. And it gets even more major when you look at the large drawers, where with the ladies' closet, once again, the grain is perpendicular to the front of the drawer. And similar to the bottom construction, you have these mitered runners across both sides and the front, cut and mitered at the back. Whereas a very different, but typical Charleston construction with parallel grain on the desk and bookcase, runners along the sides, and then this center mutton. This is two boards, a board here, and they're dadoed into this center mutton. And the center mutton is a construction feature that we see on Charleston case furniture over several decades. It's one of the important defining construction features of colonial Charleston furniture. So if we go back to this group, we can look at the ladies' closet, and we can look at this cabinet on dressing chest and see tremendous design similarities in a way that suggests Dean's presence. We can look at the scrolled pediments. We can look at the blind carved Greek key friezes. And its drawer construction actually varies. The top drawer on this piece, I haven't had a chance to inspect it personally, but the way it's described in Bivens and Rauschenberg, the top drawer is more like this piece. The bottom drawers are more like the other group with the center mutton. So there's some sort of cross collaboration going on. And I think in many ways, that's what we're dealing with here. We're coming to terms with the complexity of the mid-18th century Charleston furniture trade, the collaboration that exists between carvers and cabinet makers. And while this very uniquely Scottish Edinburgh form can be attributed to the right off the boat cabinet maker, Robert Deans, whose construction, according to Adam Bowett's latest chronology of case construction, is dead on for a British urban trained cabinet maker who's coming up in the cabinet shop in the 1730s and 1740s, and that's what Deans brings. We can relate that to this piece that has some similarities, other differences in construction in a way that suggests collaboration. The form itself is interesting. The only other southern example of this that I know of doesn't have the scroll pediment, but it's from the Robert Walker shop in Virginia, and it's in a private collection represented within this room. But the desk and bookcase is something different. It's Henry Burnett's carving, but it's not Robert Dean's cabinet shop. And in fact, this is I think now the earliest piece of Charleston furniture that we can identify that has that fret that we think of so frequently with Charleston furniture. Now, what's interesting is if you go through John and Brad's book page by page and stitch it together, they were already in many ways onto this. They frequently talk about how this desk and bookcase and its construction details bear such a strong relationship to these later desk and bookcases. Although now we're beginning to get into the period where Henry Burnett is dead and Robert Deans has left town. So a bit as Gary said, when you start doing your profiling, the number of candidates gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And so if you just look at the pediments on these pieces, and this is how I would date them, I don't think the fret really shows up in Charleston before Chippendale that April talked about in 1755. So I think this piece kind of has to be 1755 with the popularity of that up until about 1760 when Burnett dies. So Burnett's carving, working with the cabinet shop, but a cabinet shop that goes past Burnett's death and continues some of these same design traditions. And then later continues to modify again. It's a large shop with multiple craftsmen. It's absorbing new designs. It's modifying the fret. It's altering scroll pediments and beginning to do new stylish things with new carvers and open pierced frets. And in fact, John and Brad even say that the construction and the design and the layout of all these desk and bookcases and some related double chests and other Charleston case forms actually brings you all the way up to the Great Library bookcase in MESDA's collection, now on loan to Colonial Williamsburg for the Great and Varied Culture exhibition. And I think we can place it with all of its veneers and mitered corners beginning to show some relationship to that German school, but in a very British Chippendale way. This is from the early 1770s, 1770 to 75. So if we lay out all of those parameters and do all of those deductions and look at all these construction similarities, who pops through in a big way? And I think we might be on the verge of having to make a significant admission that Milby Burton had it right. And that in fact, it has to be one of the people in the Big Four. And it probably is Thomas Elf, who arrives on the scene in Charleston in 1745 and dies in 1775, who had the connection to Henry Burnett to employ him as a carver in his shop during his lifetime, but who was also affiliated with people like Robert Deans, with people like Samuel Carty, and his bio may well be the very one that best matches this shop group that bears consistent construction over 3 decades. But here's what's interesting. We know a little bit about Samuel Carty. We know he came from Dublin. There is an apprenticeship record. There's a marriage record. There's his affiliation with the Dublin Guild for Builders and Master Joiners. But that's about it. Thomas Elf, before he arrives in Charleston, we know nothing. Henry Burnett, before he arrives in Charleston, we know nothing. Robert Deans, we can go into his world. We can recreate his world. We can read the testimony of servants and the wives of fencing masters and the post office clerk and the Kirk treasurer and the whole group of downtown Edinburgh craftsmen who are all part of that world in the 1740s in a way that is really unique, I think, in colonial American decorative arts records in terms of being able to understand a craftsman who gets on the boat, comes to the colonies, and why they do it. We can understand that he had a little bit of William Adam, but he had a little bit of Thomas Rakewell. He was a combination of the two. But what he really did was he brought this Edinburgh world of Francis Brodie and William Adam and Baroque design of the 1730s and 40s, the milieu in which he trained and that he would have known growing up in this world, being patronized by somebody as important as Lord Milton, who at the same time was patronizing Adam and Brodie. Those are his connections. And he brings that to Charleston in the 1750s. And now I think we have the ability to look at the ladies' closet in a whole new light. We have the ability to look at the architectural evidence at Drayton Hall with its revised construction date in a whole new light. And we can look at the other great houses built in Charleston in the 1750s, understanding that Robert Deans was one of the Big Four, with Thomas Elf and Samuel Carty and Henry Burnett doing the carving. And we can look at how patrons like Benjamin and Anne Lawton Smith were part of that emerging merchant planter aristocracy of colonial Charleston, whose families had been there for 2 or 3 generations, made tremendous fortunes. And they were ready to express that with houses and furniture that spoke to Charleston's new sophistication. And I think we can assign a lot of that to Robert Deans and his 9 lives, a career that spanned several decades in 3 cities on 2 continents, because he was constantly running away from the sound of the bell. Thank you very much.